Chain of events, cause and effect. We analyse what went right and what went wrong, as we discover that many outcomes can be predicted, planned for, and even prevented. I'm John Chidgey, and this is Causality. Causality is entirely supported by you. If you'd like to support us and keep the show ad-free, you can by becoming a premium supporter. Premium supporters have access to early release, high-quality versions of episodes, as well as bonus material from all of our shows not available anywhere else. Just visit engineer.network/causality to learn how you could help this show to continue to be made. Thank you. Starting on the 8th of January through to the end of the month, we're offering an additional month discount on top of the 2 months you already get discounted for annual patrons, but it's only for a limited time. It's available for premium and above, so if you've been on the fence about supporting the show and want access to bonus materials and early episode releases, then it's never been easier. Get in while you can. Thank you. We've also recently launched a video podcast about all things whiskey, if that's your thing. Just visit engineer.network/whiskey without the E to check it out if you're interested. Stardust Nightclub. In Artan, in Dublin County, the Stardust Nightclub was a well-frequented spot for nighttime entertainment, drinks and dancing from the late 1970s. In 1948, Scott's Foods Limited, owned by the Butterley family, opened their food factory in a newly constructed building in Artan, making a variety of things, including condiments like jam. In 1978, the owners chose to convert the factory building into an amenity centre instead, which would eventually consist of the Silver Swan, which was a bar, the Lantern Rooms, which were function rooms, and the Stardust nightclub. The nightclub had, like most nightclubs, a dance floor with tables and chairs surrounding it, as well as a stage. There's a shock. But it also had 2 bars and 2 separate seating alcoves, with one in the northern end of the club and the other in the western end, of which the western one alone had seating for 280 people. Although it had only been operating for a few short years, by 1981 its popularity had grown significantly, particularly amongst the younger age demographic. Despite the local area experiencing a high level of unemployment at that time, it was nevertheless very popular, and there were a growing number of cases of people attempting to avoid the cover charge by entering through several of the side exit doors of the building. This will become relevant shortly. Now let's talk about the incident. On the evening of the 13th of February 1981, St. Valentine's Day Eve, the Stardust was hosting a special disco event. Mr. Eamon Butterley, the nightclub's general manager, had an approved special exemption order that permitted the extended sale of food and beverages that evening beyond 11 p.m. through to 2 a.m. the following morning on the 14th of February. The exemption was for a house dinner dance, for which Mr. Butterley suggested that the £3 disco admission included a plate of sausages and chips more so than alcohol, though it was reported that alcohol was easily available the entire evening. Whilst the number of patrons is debated, the most agreed upon estimate is 841 people, not including staff, were present by late in the evening. Officially, there were only 775 people based on ticket sales alone. However, more had slipped in without paying. The employees at the venue's entry were also not reliably checking identification, with the minimum age of entry supposedly 21 years old for the disco event. In reality, 83% of the patrons were less than that age. At 1:15 a.m. on the 14th of February, now Valentine's Day, the long-awaited dance competition had begun on the main dance floor. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, the winners of the disco competition were giving a victory dance demonstration on the main stage when small puffs of smoke became visible. At the time, onlookers initially reported that this appeared to be smoke from dry ice, which was commonly used for various stage acts as a stage effect, and few thought anything of it. At least, not initially. It was not dry ice. Shortly afterwards, some patrons noticed that some seats were on fire in a closed-off seating area and raised the alarm to others in the premises, and by 1:41 a.m., multiple chairs had caught on fire. Multiple employees attempted to fight the fire with water-based fire extinguishers, but were not successful. At 1:43 a.m., one of the barmen, Mr. Lawrence Neville, called 999, alerting the fire department of the fire and requesting urgent assistance. By 1:44 a.m., the flames had reached the alcove's false ceiling, and it rapidly collapsed as the fire was now burning out of control. People were already heading for the exits, and panic had started to set in. By 1:45 a.m., the walls that were covered in a mixture of painted foam tiles and carpet tiles were on fire, spreading through the main ballroom, and it took very little time for the main ceiling section to collapse, with the chairs and tables now also catching alight. The smoke produced by the fire was thick and black, heavy in soot that quickly reduced visibility. The people trying to exit predominantly headed for the main entrance door. However, many people made, instead, for the side exit doors, the fire escape doors, since they were closer. There were 6 exits in the Stardust nightclub. One door at the front of the building was chained and locked with a steel padlock, and even if it had been unchained and unlocked, the DJ's van was partially obstructing the door from opening fully on the outside of the building. 2 fire escape doors on the eastern wall had chains across the exit-release push bars, which had the appearance of being locked, and the chains interfered with the door latch release mechanism. One witness described them as being draped over the push bar, whilst another described them as being literally wrapped around the push bar, making them difficult to remove in the panic, even though they weren't technically affixed with a lock. Additionally, one of the eastern wall exits had been completely obstructed by a bottle skip on the inside, with the other obstructed by tables. There were 2 other doors that were open and unobstructed. However, they were located at the northern end of the space and became more difficult to reach as the fire progressed. The main entrance door was the primary exit pathway for people trying to escape. However, it quickly became choked with people trying to get out in the panic. Being a converted factory building, there weren't very many windows. In fact, the entire east side of the building essentially had none at the nightclub level. However, some people had made for the toilets that were required to have windows for ventilation. However, those windows had been secured using a combination of steel plates and metal grills. Outside the club, people attempted to use sledgehammers, axes, and even tried a tow rope attached to a car to try and remove the metal from the windows without success. At 1:49 a.m., the first fire tender, FB61 from Kilbarrack Fire Station, arrived at the scene and began deploying. At 8:51 a.m., the first firefighter entered the scene and was already too late for many people when the blaze was brought under control and put out hours later. Almost half of the structure's roof had been burned down completely. By 1:58 a.m., there were 6 fire tenders on the scene fighting the blaze to bring it under control. In the aftermath, the bodies of some of the victims were found piled and huddled around the blocked emergency exit doors. 214 people had suffered injuries in the incident, and 48 people had died. The age of the victims ranged from 26 years old at the most to only 16 years old. The fire was the largest fire disaster in the state's history. So what went wrong? The problem with this incident is the lack of definitive evidence as to what specifically started the fire. Suggestions included a cigarette butt or something improperly stored in the storeroom. However, the leading theory was an electrical fault. The most popular electrical fault theory early on was that the fault had come from a hot press at the main bar. The reality is that forensics at the time were not as advanced, and without evidence, it was impossible to prove this one way or the other. Even though several witnesses that were regulars at the Stardust stated that they had seen electrical wiring exposed and sparks coming from different areas around the building in the weeks before the fire, there was nothing conclusive found to support these assertions. An inquest looked into the electrical load on the circuits in the building in an attempt to explain the alleged failing wiring, and when questioned, the manager of Stardust stated he was not aware that the recommended electrical capacity had been exceeded in certain areas of the bar and dance hall. Of course, overloading an electrical cable will cause it to run hot, melt, or deteriorate the insulation as a result of this, but will eventually lead to electrical arcing, so that is plausible, but ultimately it couldn't be proven as the cause in this case. In the most recent inquest, the suggestion now is the fire was caused by an electrical fault in an airing cupboard. Beyond preventing the fire from starting then, we need to shift our focus instead to the evacuation. Firstly, and probably obviously, the blocked exits. Clearly, the single biggest contributor to the number of people that lost their lives were the fire exit blockages. In a similar fashion to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory we covered in episode 43, the fire exit doors would have allowed many more people to escape, but they were blocked. When questioned in one of the inquests, Mr. Eamon Butterley, at the time aged 78 and former manager of the Stardust, said he made the decision that the venue's exit doors should be locked until as late as midnight following the suggestions of the head doorman. His statement in October of 1981, Mr. Butterley stated that locking the doors had been, and I quote, forced on me by the fact a large number of people were getting in for free due to the actions of their friends who were opening exit doors from the inside. End quote. The policy of putting chains over exit doors had been in place for somewhere between 3 weeks and several years, depending upon which testimonial Mr. Butterley was giving, the tribunal or the Irish police. An insurance inspector's testimony later provided suggests that it was more the latter than the former. Whilst the chains, fully locked on one, either draped or wrapped, but technically unlocked on two others, were both intentional. Let's not forget the chained but unlocked two were also blocked through apparent negligence. Certainly, parking your DJ's van in front of the door would have made it easier to get equipment in and out of the building, but to then lock the door and leave the van there, obstructing part of that exit, is lazy or perhaps careless. The skip bin on the inside was to be used for empty bottles. And yes, it's important to have a rubbish bin, but putting that in front of the exit, hey, let's put that skip in the open space in front of the door rather than shift some tables and put it there, seems like the thought process that was applied. Or perhaps it wasn't. If you shift your mindset to securing the doors to prevent unwanted entry from the outside, then placing additional physical barriers on the inside would be seen as an additional deterrent and was potentially intentional. The Dublin Fire Brigade had carried out a spot check inspection of the Stardust nightclub about 1 month before the fire, and no findings were put forward to prevent the venue from continuing to operate. It's not clear if the chains were on the doors at the time of their inspection or if any of the doors were obstructed in any way at that time. The nightclub's operating license fell under the Public Dance Halls Act of 1935, which is an interesting act that was partly directed by the Catholic Church of the time, but never mind that, in which fire safety is one of the things considered for determining, and I quote, the suitability of the premises, end quote, for being a dance hall. Captain Michael Maguire, the then chairman of the Chief Fire Officers Association, was quoted as saying that the applicable legislation at the time, and I quote, did not place the responsibility on the owners of these places. As a result, fire exit doors could be obstructed and windows barred for security reasons, end quote. In an amendment following the incident, the Act was modified to ensure exit ways remained clear and unobstructed, with the current Fire Safety Guide under the Fire Services Act, Regulation 4, reads very clearly, and again I'll quote, all escape routes are kept unobstructed and immediately available for use. Doors, gates, and other like barriers across escape routes are not secured in such a manner that they cannot easily and immediately be opened. End quote. Let's talk a bit about flame retardant materials. I accept whilst the use of flame retardant materials won't stop things from burning entirely, it will make fires more difficult to get started and more difficult to progress if they do ignite. During both inquests, Mr. Richard Williams provided testimony in his position as a fire surveyor that had worked for Hibernian Insurance during the period of operation of the Stardust nightclub. Interestingly, in 1979, whilst he was underwriting, he had recommended against the insurance company providing a quote to cover the Stardust against loss from fire. Again, in 1981, acting this time as an independent surveyor for another insurance company, he also made similar commentary. During the second inspection, he also noticed an emergency push-bar exit door had been chained, and when questioned, staff replied that the chains were removed before the premise was open to the public. During the second inquest, he stated, and I quote, I reported on the fire risk, which I deemed as pretty horrendous, and recommended that we did not quote, end quote. He described the new cold room that had been constructed from aluminium and polystyrene foam insulation and noted that it was highly combustible. Beyond that, a number of walls in the building were covered in tiles made from polystyrene that had been painted over, and that the false ceiling was also made out of polystyrene. Polystyrene as a building material was very popular in the 1970s because it was cheap, it is a great sound and thermal insulator, and it's very easy to work with. It can be made into pretty much any shape that you might need. Why it's bad is that if it catches a light, it releases carbon monoxide, obviously, as well as highly toxic styrene gas. Styrene gas affects the human nervous system. It slows down reaction time and it causes people to lose their balance and have difficulty concentrating. It's not what you need when you're trying to escape a burning building, that's for sure. Thankfully, its use as a building material has dropped off significantly in the 80s and 90s and since. Finally, we'll talk a bit about fire training. When interviewed by the inquest, multiple Stardust nightclub door staff told the inquest that they had never been given any fire safety training. Whilst it doesn't spell it out in the information I have available, I imagine this means no training on how to use a fire extinguisher, no fire drills. And honestly, what would a fire drill have looked like at the Stardust anyway? Step 1, find the key for the padlock and unlock it. Really. Let's talk about the aftermath. It's sometimes the case that there are multiple investigations into incidents. It's not that uncommon, but in this case, however, in the 4 decades since the incident, there have been multiple investigations, reports, and tribunals. So I'll just list the major ones. The Keene Tribunal. It was the first inquiry and held its first public meeting only 12 days following the incident, concluding that the fire was most likely caused by arson, which effectively, legally, exonerated the Butterleys from any responsibility. Headed by Justice Ronan Keene, it was published in 1982 and was critical of Dublin Corporation, likely called the Corpo at the time, but now it's just called the Dublin City Council, for failures in enforcing building regulations and fire safety inspections. It also criticised the Department of the Environment for having inadequate fire prevention services and for what it called deficiencies in training of the local fire department. The report also stated that the managers and owners of the Stardust had used, and I quote, recklessly dangerous practices, end quote, relating to the emergency exit doors. Another point of note in this report was that it found that the Stardust was selling alcohol, and I quote, without being duly licensed to sell, and that it was sold to a number of persons under the age of 18 by people that were themselves under the age of 18, noting that anyone that did that should be guilty of an offence. Despite these findings, no criminal prosecutions were ever made. The arson ruling, however, was dismissed 28 years later by a jury following a prolonged legal challenge by relatives of the victims due to the lack of evidence that the fire was actually caused by arson. The Victims' Compensation Tribunal. Now, this tribunal was chaired by Mr. Justice Donal Barrington, and it was held in 1986 in order to group together a number of claims that had been brought in relation to the blaze. Rather than go through all of the details, it noted that the total compensation paid to victims was approximately £10.5 million in 1986 pounds, which in today's money is £30 million or $38 million US dollars. The tribunal noted that many of the survivors that were injured in the incident had long-term scarring from their burns, damage to their vocal cords and lungs from smoke inhalation, as well as post-traumatic stress that had pushed several to drugs and alcohol, and in some cases, suicide. As part of accepting state compensation, the victims and families of the victims had signed a document that waived the right to make any further claims against any defendants. The Coffey Report. The government commissioned an independent examination of new evidence about the Stardust fire. This was chaired by Paul Coffey SC in 2008. Despite the new evidence presented, there was still no definitive ruling on the cause of the fire. That said, this contributed to the overturning of the Keene Report's arson claim the following year. The McCartan Report. Under growing pressure from families of victims, the government appointed retired judge Mr. Justice Patrick McCartan to examine the new evidence put forward. His conclusion in November of 2017 was that no new investigation was warranted, stating, and I quote, having considered all of the material evidence submitted to the committee, there is no new or updated evidence disclosed in the meaning of the terms of this assessment, and no new inquiry is warranted. End quote. Finally, the Stardust inquests. In 2018, following still more public pressure, the Attorney General agreed they would consider a request to hold a second formal inquiry into the Stardust incident. It wasn't until March the following year when the application was formally made to the Attorney General. Ms. Antoinette Keegan was a survivor of the fire, although she had lost her sisters Mary and Martina in the incident, and had been a long-standing champion of the victims of Stardust. There was a 37-page-long submission on behalf of Ms. Keegan and relatives of 42 of the victims that had died in the incident, which in September 2019, the Attorney General finally greenlit a new inquest, noting, and I quote, there was an insufficiency of inquiry as to how the deaths occurred, end quote. in reference to the original inquest. In a demonstration of rapid government process, the first hearings took place in April of 2023, some 3.5 years later, although admittedly some of the plans were most likely slowed down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The inquest was the longest and the largest in the history of the Republic of Ireland, lasting 122 days and hearing testimony from 373 witnesses in total. The report was the most extensive yet on the Stardust incident, weighing in at 673 pages long. The jury returned their verdict of unlawful killing on the 19th of April, 2024. Despite the many findings in many reports and inquests, I can find no evidence that any person has been held accountable specifically for the incident, nor has anyone been directly convicted. No jail time, nothing. For what it's worth, however, the Irish Prime Minister, or as they call them in Ireland, the Taoiseach, Simon Harris, on the 23rd of April 2024, formally and officially apologised following the conclusion of the latest tribunal, making the following statement. And I quote, "For all of this, as Prime Minister, on behalf of the state, I apologise unreservedly to all the families of the Stardust victims and all the survivors for the hurt that was done to them and for the profoundly painful years of struggle for the truth." End quote. I mean, he said more than that, but that was the most important bit. Better than nothing, I suppose. So what do we learn from all of this? Irrespective of the cause of the fire, and irrespective of the legislation at the time, that could have been tighter, the motivation behind the application of the locks and the lack of care about obstructing fire exits is, sadly, nothing new. The primary motivator of this intentional behaviour was primarily money. You could argue that they did it to ensure they kept crowd numbers to a manageable level in the venue as part of their operating licence. You could argue that they did this to ensure that underage people weren't being let in, potentially threatening their operating licence. But if that was their goal, they weren't doing a very good job. I mean, I get it. Mates letting their mates in for free down the side of the club, that's nothing new. And considering it was a period of high unemployment, that's even less surprising. The modern solution to this specific issue is to put a ridiculously loud alarm on the fire exit door and then warn people that if they use the door for any reason, that alarm is going to go off and we're all going to know that you opened that door. And if it's a genuine fire, then that's a big benefit. It alerts everybody something is wrong. And everybody wins. But that's how it's done today. It was not back then. The simplest blind spot that we face as human beings is our normalization of risk and hence blindness to it. When a normal person walks into a room, they'll generally see, well, a room, maybe with some stuff in it. When a building inspector, a civil engineer, or a firefighter walks into a room, they'll see the exit signs, the exit doors, the pathways in between, and they look at what can go wrong, picturing the chaos of people running everywhere in a panic, and what barriers could potentially lay between those people and their safe escape. They have to think about it from the angle of what happens when it all goes wrong. Normal people just see the normal. They don't usually see what can go wrong, and they don't think about the worst case scenario. And we have to do better. Looking around the office that you work in, the site that you work at, and just as importantly, your own home, if it's a separate building, an apartment building, whatever it is, look, really look and see, if a fire started in this room, how would I escape? Think about different locations in the house or the office and ask that question over and over and over again. If you have security grills fitted, especially to both sides of a glass window, then look at emergency escape security grills that don't require a tool to open them from the inside. You open the glass window, release the latch, and the grill swings open and outwards, and you can easily escape. Fit them to every room if you can. They cost more than the traditional grills, but they could save you or your loved ones' lives someday. If you accept that fires are inevitable from a plethora of ignition sources, then the real question isn't really about how do you prevent fires, or how do you prevent them from spreading quickly, but how do you get out? Because fires can spread very quickly, far more quickly than you think. And if you can't put them out really fast, you have to get out. Having multiple exits in an enclosed space ultimately is about protecting people's lives in the event of a fire, and they're pointless if they don't work. It's not just enough to have them, you need to confirm that the egress pathways are clear of obstacles and are open and ready when needed. The key lesson to take away from this is that anyone can open their eyes and raise their concerns about a fire safety risk. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are, you just need to look, pay attention, think about it, and care. The tragedy in the Stardust nightclub incident seems to lay more in the apparent priorities of the club itself in response to local economics driving poor behaviors and freeloading patrons. Over time, when they prioritized that security component, they became blind to the risk that they'd created in attempting to address that issue. Laws and regulations were amended, and that's a good thing. But it still comes back to people staying on top of cleanliness and maintenance and understanding the risk. So my challenge to you is, open your eyes, look around you, and if a fire started right now, how would you get out? We can't bring back the 48 people that died in the Stardust fire, but we can open our eyes and we can pay attention to fire risks. And we can do better. If you're enjoying Causality and you'd like to support us and keep the show ad-free, you can by becoming a premium supporter. We have support options via Patreon, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube memberships now as well. Just visit engineer.network/causality to learn how you can help this show to continue to be made. Thank you. A big thank you to all of our supporters. A special thank you to our silver producers, Mitch Bielger, Shane O'Neill, Jared Roman, Katarina Will, Chad During, and Ian Gallagher. And an extra special thank you to our gold producers, Stephen Bridle, Kellen Frodelius Fujimoto, and our gold producer, known only as R. Starting the 8th of January through to the end of the month, we're offering an additional month's discount on top of the 2 months you already get discounted for annual patrons. But it's only for a limited time. It's available for premium and above, so if you've been on the fence about supporting the show and want access to bonus materials and early episode releases, then it's never been easier. Get in while you can. Thank you. We've also recently launched a video podcast about all things whiskey. If that's your thing, just visit engineer.network/whiskey without the E to check it out if you're interested. Causality is heavily researched, and links to all materials used for the creation of this episode are contained in the show notes. You can find them in the text of the episode description of your podcast player or on our website. You can follow me on the Fediverse at Chidgey@engineer.space or the network at engnet@engineer.space. This was Causality. I'm John Chidgey. Thank you so much for listening.